Hi, everyone. Hold on to your horses and tighten up your britches. Today, I have yet another set of shocking stories that are sure to make your head spin. You might even learn the truth about something that makes it impossible for you to sleep tonight. So get yourself comfortable, grab your favorite drink, and cozy up with that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. I'm guessing that what I experienced has to do with the fact that humans have occupied this area for at least 5,000 years. At least that's the only explanation I can come up with. The humans had something to do with this. I work in Joshua Tree National Park as a park ranger, and what happened to me happened at about 9 o'clock at night while patrolling on my own. I was driving on a dirt road off of Keys View Road, which is about 6 miles from the main part of the park. The area where I was is very remote, and there's no real structure for miles in any direction. There are only Joshua trees and trails and lots of open space with cactus everywhere. I was doing a routine patrol of the park at night because we have had some vandalism and theft in this area. I was driving slowly down the road, which of course has no streetlights or anything like that. The moon was out, but not very bright. There are no other sources of light out there. So as I'm driving along, my headlights hit something big and white on the side of the road, up ahead about 50 feet. At first I thought it might be an elk or deer carcass that had been out for a while, but then I realized that what I saw was way too big to be any kind of animal carcass. It looked like somebody had placed a huge white tablecloth on the ground and wrapped something up in it. I approached slowly because I thought it might be some kind of a prank or something. Or at least something I needed to be attentive to anyway. As I got closer, I realized that this thing was huge. I'd say the best way to describe it would be that it looked like a sheet draped over a very large mass. And then what happened next happened so fast that it's hard to put into words what actually exactly happened. All I know is that out of nowhere, an extremely large dog jumped onto my car and started scratching at the window, seemingly trying to get inside. It scared me half to death because this huge animal came out of nowhere and the white mass was still on the ground. I literally had no forewarning or sense that anything was about to happen. I immediately stopped the car and the thing jumped off and positioned itself, blocking my path, and it stared at me through my front windshield. I then turned on my spotlight in order to see what this thing was, hoping that the light didn't intensify it. What I saw was very confusing. The first thought was that it must be some kind of wild dog that had been feeding off the garbage people leave in the park. But then I noticed that it was standing on 2 legs and not all 4s like a normal dog would do. It stood upright about 6 feet tall, had extremely large muscles, long dark hair like a German shepherd, and its face looked more human than anything else. The eyes were also very human looking, but they seemed to glow an orange color when the lights hit them. The animal seemed to be confused by the lights at first, so then I beeped the horn to see if it would go away, hoping it was just some lost dog or something. But when I started beeping the horn, the thing growled at me. I was so freaked out by this point that I threw the car in reverse, got it turned around as quickly as I could, and I drove away as fast as possible. I have no idea what it was, but the longer I thought about it, it really looked nothing like a dog, even though that was my first instinct. It was more human than anything else. It looked like a werewolf or something out of a movie. I had driven a few miles away. I stopped my vehicle just to think. But then after about 10 minutes passed, I was feeling a bit more relaxed and lucid, so I decided to go back to see if it was still there. I approached slowly, with the spotlight on the whole time, of course. But when I got back to where it happened, the animal was nowhere. That really wasn't all that surprising, actually. But the shocker was that the white pile was gone. I don't know how it got removed from there, and I still don't even like thinking about it. I looked around for about 10 minutes, but there was no sign of anything, not even any drag marks on the ground. Generally, the area is so dark around there that you can't see anything beyond 20 feet or so. I don't know what to think of this, and I've never had anything like this happen before while working in the park. I've seen plenty of animals out here, bears, mountain lions, even a few wild dogs, but nothing like this has ever happened before. The next day I told my coworkers about what happened, and they instantly had very strong ideas about it. Some thought it might be some kind of werewolf or dog man because there are legends about it, local legends, that talk about such things existing here. But the truth is that I'm not sure if I believe in werewolves or dogmen. But then again, after last night, who knows what I believe? Once the intense fear settled down in me, an overall sense of uneasiness and anxiety took over my body, basically 24/7 for about a month. It scared me enough to where I didn't go back on patrol by myself for even months after that. To this day, I'm still not sure what it was. But I do know for sure that it wasn't just some stray dog, animal that's often seen in the park. For that, I am very sure. Dear Lilith, I'm a realtor in Gaylord, Michigan, which I feel is a great place to live. The city has beautiful views of the Great Lakes and Lake Charlevoix. It's also close to both Traverse City and Petoskey, making for easy day trips. If you're looking for some outdoor adventure, a hike through the Gaylord State Forest is a great way to spend a day, which is exactly what I was planning on doing after work. It was June 15th in 2017, and I had just gotten done showing a few houses to clients who lived in southern Michigan. They were basically looking for a great place to raise their kids. The husband recently got transferred to Gaylord, and they loved the town. From my assessment, I could see that they would probably be happy here. So after we looked at their 7th house, their brains were on overload, and we decided to call it a day. I called my husband Rick to see if he was done for the day too. He was, so we made plans to meet at Gaylord State Forest to do a little afternoon hike. It took me about 15 minutes to get there. He got there about 10 minutes later. So we walked our normal loop through the park, starting off on one of our favorite trails, the Woodland Trail. As I look back on it, I remembered that something didn't seem right that day. Something was off. But at the same time, I just pushed those thoughts out of my head since Rick and I were deep in conversation. We walked for about 45 minutes and talked about all sorts of topics like how Rick's work was going since he recently got a promotion, and what we might do to celebrate my birthday that was coming up in a few weeks. At one point, we stopped and looked at each other as a shrill noise cut through the air, a noise unlike anything either of us had ever heard before. We stood there listening for a few minutes, but when it didn't happen again, we continued on. We eventually ended up close to Lake Charlevoix and stopped at a few picnic benches to have a bite to eat. I opened my day pack and took out an apple. Rick got out his usual trail mix. We made sure to carry out any of our trash, too, since we were very aware of leaving nothing left behind. Eventually, we continued on with our walk, this time heading to the Ridge Trail, which took us through pine trees before reaching a lookout point. There we could see more of Lake Charlevoix below. Everything was still strangely still and quiet, though. Looking back, there were no forest sounds at all at this point, which, knowing what I know now, makes sense. From there, we stopped at the falls for a few minutes, making sure we didn't stay too long since it was getting close to sunset, and it would be easy to get lost in this area of the park after night. We started back towards our cars, talking about how the next time we should just bring some fishing gear because there's also a stream where people catch trout. And right then, we heard the shrill scream again. But just like before, it only happened once, and didn't happen again. Even still, we picked up our pace a bit and continued to head back the way we had come. We crossed a bridge over Meadowbrook Creek that's one of many that connects the parts of the park, and it was now dusk, and Rick stopped and pointed out what he thought might be an eagle's nest high above in the trees. Luckily, I had my zoom lens with me so we could get a closer look, and sure enough, it was an eagle's nest, and Rick spotted one of the eagles perched on top of the tree, looking down at us from its vantage point in the branches. Now, Rick's an avid bird watcher. I never really got that into it, but I do find them interesting. He then also pointed out a black-capped chickadee that was perched on the side of our path. "That one right there, that's the black-capped chickadee," and he went on, but I was barely listening after a while. I realized that I was still feeling creeped out by those screams that we heard. And I eventually interrupted him and told him I just wanted to keep moving along back towards the car because I was feeling weird. He was good about it. He agreed to head back with me, so we started off in silence. And then, as we headed back, we began to smell something foul that seemed to be coming from the path ahead of us. I mentioned it to Rick, and he said he smelled it too. Said that he thought it was probably just a skunk, though. But as far as I was concerned, this did not smell like a skunk. It was a really foul odor. I was thinking it might be the carcass of something big, like a deer or even a coyote. Eventually, we made the left turn at the fork in the path, and that's because we had seen the tree that was completely covered in bird poop. That was actually our landmarker that told us that we were close and on the right path that would take us back to our cars. But this is also when I really noticed something wasn't right. I felt a change in the air, and all the birds stopped chirping, and all the movement in the forest stopped, and it got really quiet. Rick also noticed it. It made me think of all the movies where something bad happens to campers or hikers right at this point. And this was all just too weird for me not to be worried. We literally started jogging and reached a clearing in the woods when we heard unusual sounds. Loud, obvious sounds, especially noticeable with all the other silence in the woods. They sounded like huge branches snapping off from trees, or even like trees were being knocked down or pushed over by something coming closer to us. And that's when we saw it. We both saw it. The creature was 8 or 9 feet tall and had mangy fur all over its body. It had the head of a German shepherd or maybe a wolf, but the body of a man. Its eyes glowed yellow, and it was snarling at us with fangs like something out of a horror movie. Had I manifested this thing? I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand it. What was I seeing? Rick grabbed me, pulled me behind a tree, but it was too late. The creature had seen us and was now coming directly at us, running as fast as a horse would gallop. Luckily, Rick always carries his pistol with him on our walks just for protection, and he fired at the ground in front of the creature. The noise of the gun startled it, which caused it to rear up its head and let out a shrill scream. The exact scream that we had heard earlier, twice. I was now completely frozen in my tracks. I was sure we were about to be attacked. But before I could say or do anything, the thing turned off the path and fled into the woods. Rick and I were speechless. All we could do was look at each other. He finally was able to yell, "Run!" and we both bolted to our cars. We got in his car, sat there for a little bit as neither one of us felt able to drive. We were both blabbering simultaneously, trying to process it, but it was obvious that we both felt that we had been lucky to escape with our lives. I was never a believer of monsters before, but this day changed me. I'll admit it. Now it's been years since this experience happened, but it still haunts me, both when I'm awake and when I'm asleep. I hear Rick dreaming about it too, but I've never brought that up with him because I don't want him to have to think about it when he's awake. I mean, it seems like he doesn't remember his dreams because he doesn't talk to me about them, but I can't be sure. Maybe he's just protecting me. Rick and I still do go hiking, but we haven't been back to Gaylord State Forest since that incident. He always still brings his pistol, and we never go hiking close to dusk or dawn. I've read folklore about the Michigan Dogman, and I thought it was all make-believe. That thing, that creature with my own eyes, and experienced it running straight at us, I knew then that there really are true monsters in the world. In my late 20s, I got really into kayaking. I went out and bought my own kayak and even an SUV to haul it so that I could do some nearby weekend trips. When I started dating my boyfriend, I got him into it too. And we started taking longer trips to kayak lakes and rivers. Once we'd done most of the good spots in our area, we started taking road trips to good kayaking areas, particularly around the Finger Lakes and then the Great Lakes. For our 2-week vacation last year, we decided to kayak around Michigan, hitting both Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. It was amazing. The coasts were beautiful and we saw wildlife and the famous Petoskey stones. Sometimes we would follow the little creeks and tributaries that emptied into the lake, just exploring. One day we found a good run of water that ran into a heavily forested area, so we decided to enter it, paddling upstream. It was a small creek, but big enough for our narrow kayaks, and the forest completely surrounded us. We had our cameras ready, hoping to catch something good. We spotted a lot of birds and some deer and smaller mammals, but nothing too crazy. After a while, the creek narrowed even more and the forest closed in, making an arch over us. It was one of the most untouched places we had ever seen, and it was amazing. We had planned on turning back down the coast by now, but we didn't want to miss this amazing opportunity. As we paddled along, I heard noises that were unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was incredibly quiet in there, so you could hear perfectly. The rippling water and our paddles, the occasional bird chirps, but then there was this louder rustling sound. Definitely the sound of a larger animal moving through the brush. As we slid through the water, the sound followed us. The animal was moving in the same direction we were, alongside the creek. I got my camera ready, hoping for something rare like a fox, but the trees were so thick that we couldn't see anything for a long time. We just heard it. Then I finally saw a quick glimpse of it, just the top of the head. I could see thick fur and pointed ears, the hint of what looked like a snout. It looked like a dog or maybe a wolf, definitely too big to be a fox. I still couldn't get a clear look at it, but I'd catch glimpses as we moved along and it continued alongside us. It was definitely creepy that something we couldn't see was following us. We decided to turn around at the same time and realized that we'd have to paddle fast or wouldn't make it back to our campsite before dark. But when we turned around, we found that the current was strong enough that we could put up our paddles and drift back. And that let me hold my camera better. I took a bunch of pictures as we drifted. As we floated back, I was sure that the dog, Wolf, would keep going the other way. But after about 10 minutes, I started to hear the rustling again. I pointed it out to my boyfriend, and we both watched with our cameras ready. Once or twice, I got a picture that included the ears or the tip of its snout sticking out. But I still couldn't tell what it was. I was leaning forward, pretty excited to see it, and I really wanted to get a picture of it, more for the confirmation of it. I decided to try whistling to see if I could get it to come further out of the brush. That didn't really work, not surprisingly. So then I tried tossing pieces of leftover lunch towards the sounds. I had some bits of my sandwich that I thought might entice it. I figured we were safe enough out in our kayaks. The third toss of food did the trick. The rustling stopped, and I saw movement near where the piece had landed. The animal still didn't come out all the way, but we could see more of it. We could see the head pretty clearly, but the body was still in the shadows. Even after seeing more of it, I could still tell that it wasn't a wolf or a large dog, but I wasn't sure. Something about it seemed off. The overall size and the shape of the head just wasn't right. It was only then that it occurred to me that it might be rabid or otherwise sick, and that trying to bring it closer was a bad idea. My boyfriend agreed, and we decided to paddle the rest of the way out and leave the animal alone. We heard the rustling again and knew it was still following us. The isolation and secrecy of this spot wasn't so cool anymore. It started to seem more claustrophobic. Soon we were nearing the end of the creek and would be getting to the lake soon. We could still hear the animal in the bushes along the way, but it wouldn't be able to follow us much longer. The trees ended soon, and there was open beach along the entire coast. As we neared that point, I turned to look back one more time. That's when I clearly saw the pointed ears and the dark grayish fur, and I watched in horror as it stood up, standing right at the edge of the trees, watching us with intensity, standing perfectly up on its two hind legs. It stood just like a human, perfectly balanced in a way that no dog or canine could stand. It was freaky how human-like it looked right then. As I stared at it, transfixed looking at its body, I noticed that the rest of the body didn't look canine at all. The proportions were all wrong, and the shape of its legs were wrong too. It had some hair on its body, but not thick fur that matched the head. It was beautiful in a scary kind of a way. I yelled out to my boyfriend, whose kayak was ahead of me, but by the time he turned, it was gone. Later that night, I pored over the pictures we had taken, looking for proof of what I had seen, but they were just tiny bits of fur or a glimpse of a pointed ear. Could have been anything. After researching for hours on the internet, I realized I had seen a dogman. I know it's probably strange to say, but being a park ranger in a famous national park can sometimes be very disturbing. Take it from me. I'm not complaining, but one day in particular really gave me the chills. I was working at Grand Teton National Park in 1988. I had been there for about a year, and it was my favorite park to work in until that day. Mostly because of how dark and quiet it could get. Basically, it was really peaceful. There are no really big towns or cities anywhere near it. The nearest town is Jackson, which has a population of just over 10,000 people. So needless to say, when I'm working at night, I can often see more stars than most people might ever see in their lifetime. So I was sitting in my patrol vehicle near the Snake River watching the stars and relaxing as I was finishing up my patrol for the evening. The overlook I was at is pretty much exactly what you would imagine an overlook at Grand Teton National Park to be like. It's located along a stretch of road where there are pullouts every so often where tourists can get out and take pictures with the Tetons as a backdrop. So I'm sitting there just relaxing when all of a sudden I hear this loud, high-pitched scream coming from the woods. I'm not a hunter or anything, but I've been a ranger long enough to know that whatever made that sound was not an animal. It almost sounded like someone was literally screaming as loud as they could while trying to imitate an elk or something at the same time. But it only lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then it stopped just as quickly as it started. I'm sitting there kind of freaking out and trying to figure out what it was when all of a sudden I see something moving in the trees right where I heard the noise come from. At first I thought maybe it was one of those mountain lions that people occasionally see roaming around these parts, but then I realized how big this thing was compared to the tree next to it. Whatever this thing was, it looked like it was almost as big as the tree. I could barely make out what I think looked like 2 very large eyes staring at me from behind a branch. I'm sitting there frozen in fear when all of a sudden this thing starts to move again, and I see something that made my blood run cold. The thing had no feathers or fur, it didn't have any antlers or horns, but the way it moved reminded me exactly of how an elk moves, only much faster and smoother. Its massive body just seemed to glide through the trees without making a single sound whatsoever. And then suddenly it was gone, just like that. The only reason I knew it left was because I stopped hearing the branches breaking off in the distance every few seconds, and instead, I heard nothing but crickets chirping in the distance. After about 10 minutes of sitting there shivering in my truck, I finally gathered the courage to get out. I walked over to where I had seen whatever it was moving through the trees, and I looked around for any signs of tracks or anything, but there was nothing. The ground was too hard and dry for me to find anything, so after checking a few nearby trees for claw marks or teeth marks, there were none. I decided that what I saw just Must have been an elk. Maybe one that had mange or something. Who knows? Anyway, I was done for the night, and so I headed back to base to close up my shift. I worked another 3 nights after that one with no problems, but then on the 4th night, something happened that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a Saturday night in September, so there were more tourists than usual visiting the park. There's usually a bit of a rush in September since it's basically the last chance before winter comes around. I had just finished doing a walkthrough at Jenny Lake Campground, which is located just outside of Jackson Hole and right inside the park, when I noticed an older couple sitting by their RV looking pretty upset. Their dog, who they said was an Australian shepherd named Max, had run off somewhere into the woods behind their campsite about 30 minutes ago and hadn't come back. So I told them not to worry because dogs are pretty good at finding their way back. I told them not to leave their campsite and that I would go find him. So I grabbed my flashlight and I headed into the woods behind their campsite. It's funny because when you're a park ranger, people automatically assume that you know everything about nature and animals. But the truth is, I honestly get a bit scared at night patrolling by myself because of all the stories I've heard from other rangers about bears, mountain lions, all kinds of animals roaming around looking for food. Anyway, so I'm walking through the woods with my flashlight on, looking everywhere for Max, when suddenly something makes a noise to my right. At first I thought it was Max finally coming back, but then I realized how big this thing was compared to me when its shadow passed over me, as it ran past in front of my flashlight beam. This thing had to have been at least twice as tall as me, and it moved so fast. There's no way that it was a dog. I thought maybe it was one of those elk again, but then I remembered that what I saw the last time was way bigger than any elk would ever be. So I started to get really scared and ran back to the vehicle as fast as I could. I sat in it for about 10 minutes trying to calm down after seeing whatever this thing was. I didn't even go back to the couple at the campsite. And then, as I was sitting there, all of a sudden something slammed into the side of my vehicle so hard that it shook the whole vehicle. Whatever it was had now jumped up on the hood, and then it launched itself at my windshield. It sounded like somebody throwing a bowling ball at full speed right at me. I have no idea how this thing didn't crash through my windshield. I've seen it happen to a few rangers before. I never expected to be on the receiving end of something like that, though. And then I watched as it just stopped and stared at me. It was like it knew that I was protected by the car and it couldn't get to me. So it just gave up and walked away. As I looked at it, its snout looked longer than most wolves I've ever seen before. Its fur was a strange shade of gray, not white. But what freaked me out the most about it is that I could still feel that it was staring right into my soul. It's hard to describe. So I started my vehicle and I drove back to the ranger station as fast as I could. When I got there, I immediately told my supervisor what had happened, and he said that I was probably just imagining things. He said that there's no way anything could jump up onto a vehicle and then into the windshield like that hard without breaking it. He said that maybe I had seen elk or deer or something, but I told him about how big the thing was compared to my size when it ran past me and how fast it moved. His only response was, "Then you need to get yourself checked out by a doctor," which shocked me, honestly. It was totally unprofessional. I quit my job at Grand Teton National Park 2 months later after having nightmares almost every night about whatever that thing was that attacked my vehicle. It wasn't a normal animal, of this I'm certain. Whatever it was seems to be highly intelligent and a creature that is very much capable of killing you. Because of this, I just couldn't stay at that job any longer. I hope you all understand. I was on patrol one night when I got a call from dispatch. They told me that there had been reports coming in of strange lights in the woods near an old abandoned house in the woods at the edge of town, and they asked me to investigate it. When I arrived at the location, there were already several people standing around looking into the woods. A few of them were carrying flashlights, but mostly they just stood in the darkness, staring into the trees. As I walked up to them and asked what was going on, everyone turned to look at me with a serious expression on their faces. And then one man pointed off towards the old house and said, "You see that house way over there in the woods?" I squinted and looked where he pointed and saw a small, abandoned shack about 50 yards into the woods. It looked like it had been long deserted. From what I could see, most of its gray paint had chipped or peeled away, leaving only patches of it on the weathered wood. I nodded and he continued, "Well, many of us have been seeing lights in those trees swirling around that house." He paused for a moment to look at me seriously before continuing. "And some of us think that they are alien lights." With that, we all turned back to stare into the darkness again with renewed interest. I stood there for a moment trying to decide if they were pulling my leg or not. They all seemed serious enough, so I decided to humor them and took a few steps towards where it had become darker. As I stood there quietly, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see another man walking up to me. He was an older gentleman with a long white beard that reached down to his chest. As he walked past me towards the darkness, I asked him if he was going to the house. He stopped and looked at me with a serious expression on his face, just like everyone else's. But then in a deep, gravelly voice, he said, "I've seen them before." And that was all he said before continuing on in the darkness. After watching him walk off into the blackness, I stood there for several moments trying to decide what to do next when suddenly someone screamed from somewhere in the woods ahead of me. It sounded like a woman screaming for help, or perhaps it was someone being attacked by something horrible. Either way, it was coming from the direction that the older gentleman had just gone. Instantly, my adrenaline kicked in, and I pulled my flashlight from my belt and started running towards the screams. As I ran through the darkness, it became harder to see because of the trees, until finally they were so close together that only a small patch of sky was visible above me. And then just ahead of me, I saw a clearing with an old rusted pickup truck parked near it. Instantly, my mind registered that this must be near the old abandoned house, and so I stopped to look around for the lights or anything unusual, but everything seemed normal enough. And that's when I heard someone screaming again. This time it sounded like it came from behind me. I turned to look back into the dark woods, but could see nothing except pinpoint patches of light coming from flashlights carried by people standing way back at the edge of town, near where I started. And then suddenly another scream came from somewhere behind me. I turned to look back into the woods again, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the small clearing now was the old man with the long white beard. He stood there motionless, staring at me with his arms just hanging by his sides. Instantly, my adrenaline kicked in again, and I pulled out my pistol and I pointed it at him, but he didn't move or even flinch. Instead, he just kept looking at me as if waiting for something. Suddenly, another scream came from behind, so without taking my gun off of him, I turned to look back into the woods, and that's when I saw them. 2 glowing orange spheres were flying through the trees towards us. As they passed each tree, their light would shine through, causing bright spots on the ground beneath them. It was so surreal I can't even really describe it. They were coming towards us at a very high speed, and I could only watch in amazement as they flew past me and flew to the old man standing before me. As the glowing spheres went around him, he lifted his arms into the air and began spinning like a top. His white beard was flying around behind him while he spun faster and faster until suddenly he disappeared. And that's when I heard another scream simultaneously coming from somewhere. Instantly, I turned, looking around all through the dark woods again, but all that remained was darkness, and with only a few flashlight beams shining through it from the people, I could see nothing. The next thing I knew, someone grabbed my arm and pulled me away from where I stood in the blackness. When I turned to look at who had grabbed me, I saw it was one of my fellow police officers, and when I asked him what had happened, he just shook his head and said that it was time to go. Back at the police station, I tried to tell some of my fellow officers about what had happened, but they all just shook their heads and acted as if they didn't want to hear about it. Finally, one of them told me that several people called in claiming that they saw flying saucers, but that the department had been told to keep the sightings internal and not release any info to the public. After a few days passed and nothing more was ever said about it, I eventually convinced myself that maybe I had been imagining things due to the darkness and the adrenaline rush from chasing the screams through the woods. Either way, it was the strangest thing I've ever experienced in my life. So strange that even I doubt it really happened sometimes. It sort of feels like a dream at this point, but at the same time it's all bottled up inside me. So I had to share it with somebody I hoped would understand and not judge me. That's the hardest part of being a police officer sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to share things like this without looking like a fool. Over the years, there has been no shortage of strange stories coming out of national parks. The one I'm writing to you about took place in the summer of 2015 at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. A park ranger was on a routine patrol around midnight when he noticed a strange, wolf-like creature sitting on its haunches near the edge of Rim Drive. The ranger pulled his car over to get a better look. He said the animal had long, reddish-brown fur with a white underbelly and light brown spots all over its body. It had pointed ears, a blunt muzzle with large teeth, and very muscular hind legs. He said it appeared to be about 6 feet tall, although it was sitting down, so he later thought that perhaps it was a juvenile. He said its eyes glowed yellow in the headlights of his vehicle. After observing the animal for several minutes, it stood up and began walking towards him on its hind legs. As it approached and came within 15 feet, it dropped to all fours and bolted off into the woods. The ranger described the creature as being very fast, able to run on either 2 legs or 4 with ease. He followed it on foot for a short distance but lost sight of it once he got to thick vegetation. The following day, another park ranger found tracks that measured 17 inches long by 6 inches wide. The tracks were unusual in that they had 5 distinct claw marks instead of 4, and there were no pads between the toes. A cast was made of one set of prints which revealed an unusual pattern. Several large dots inside a circle with smaller dots on that, similar to what has been observed in Bigfoot tracks over the years. According to sources I spoke with who have worked at Crater Lake National Park, this is not the first time something like this has happened there. In the 1960s, a park ranger reported seeing a strange animal sitting on its haunches near Wizard Island. And then, in more recent years, a ranger found tracks that were very similar to those made by the 2015 creature. Many feel that the most likely explanation for these unusual tracks is that they were left by some kind of large canid, such as a wolf or a coyote. However, given their similarities to Bigfoot tracks and the eyewitness accounts of what appeared to be a bipedal wolf-like cryptid, it's possible that we're looking at an undiscovered species here. If you ask any of the park rangers who work there, they will tell you that the tracks are most likely those of a large canine. However, the fact remains that these tracks are very unusual. It's also worth noting that this area is near Crater Lake, where an unknown object was detected on radar in 1968, and a strange flying object was witnessed by several people in 1973. So take that with a grain of salt, or add that information to the reasons why these sightings could be cryptids. I don't know, but it's an interesting story to think about, either way. My life completely changed, and essentially all came crashing down the year I went hiking and camping at Yosemite. It was late May of 2008, and I was depressed. I had just broken up with my girlfriend and basically felt like I was at the end of my rope. So I decided to go on a road trip from San Francisco all the way to Yosemite National Park, which was essentially a straight shot east. If you've never been there, it's quite literally in the middle of nowhere. There are no cities within miles of it, and basically only one main road that leads into and out of it. I arrived about noon on a Saturday and immediately set up camp in the Upper Pines campground. I had all the stuff I needed, and I was ready to relax for the next few days before going back home on Monday. The campground was pretty empty. Maybe 10 to 15 other campsites were occupied. I started a small fire and began cooking lunch when I noticed some people setting up a tent about 50 yards from me. It wasn't odd since there were plenty of open spots, but it would turn out that this spot would be important later on. As I ate my food, an older couple with 2 dogs then arrived and set up their camp right next to me. They seemed nice enough, so we exchanged pleasantries as they unpacked their stuff, and then after they finished, I watched as they walked over to the trail to start hiking. I then finished eating and decided to take a walk myself. So I walked along the trail for about 10 minutes, taking in the sights, when I saw something odd off in the distance. It looked like something standing on top of one of the rock formations that jutted out from the ground. At first, I thought it was just an optical illusion because it was so far away and in a place that would be nearly impossible to get to. But as I continued to look at it, it seemed to be moving closer and further away at the same time. It also looked like whatever it was stood on 2 legs instead of 4 like an animal would. Whatever this thing was disappeared behind another rock formation, reappeared again, and then disappeared completely. This made me incredibly curious, so I decided to speed up my pace towards it. I got closer to it in about 10 minutes and looked towards where I had seen it, but saw nothing. It was at this point that I realized how quiet it was all around me. Usually when you're in nature, you hear birds chirping or the wind blowing through the trees, but it was completely silent here, except for my own breathing. I decided to continue walking down the trail to see if I could find whatever this thing was. So I kept going until the trail ended and opened up into a clearing with another trail branching off. I'm pretty sure I had seen the couple from before going down that way. As soon as I took a few steps onto this new trail, I heard something slam into the ground behind me, like a rock being thrown. I turned around immediately and scanned my surroundings, but didn't see anything out of place. No branches moved or leaves rustled. Nothing was moving. After a few seconds, I decided to keep going to see if whatever it was I had seen before had followed me. I didn't see anything, so I kept walking for about 5 minutes when I came across a small clump of trees growing tightly next to each other. As I stood there wondering how they had come to grow that way, I noticed something on the ground just beyond one of the trees that looked like a stick, but it was white in color, which was really intriguing. So I walked closer to it, and when I got close enough to pick it up, this creature that I can only describe as a monster appeared from behind the tree right next to me. It was tall, at least 8 feet. It had gray skin, black eyes, and no nose. Nothing that you could call a normal mouth either, just an opening where the face met its neck. It also had long fingers with sharp claws instead of hands. Shockingly, the creature was so startled by me that it let out this screeching sound, and then it ran away. I was too shocked to move for about 20 seconds, but when I snapped out of it, I booked it back to the campsite. The old couple from before were just returning from their hike as I arrived back at camp. They asked me if everything was all right because they said I looked like I had seen a ghost. I blurted out all about what happened, and the couple seemed genuinely concerned for me. I'm not sure if they were concerned at that point because they believed me or because they thought I was having some sort of an episode. The husband offered to sit with me for the rest of the night if I wanted him to, but after a while I felt much better, and so we all relaxed and continued about our respective business, just sitting around and relaxing at our sites. And then at around 9:30 at night, we both heard this loud noise of something slamming into one of the trees behind us. It made a noise that even shook the ground, which scared the crap out of everyone. The dog belonging to the couple started barking in the direction of the noise and wouldn't stop, so the husband got up to see what was going on, and there, behind the trees, was that same thing I had seen earlier, and it started throwing rocks at him and his dog. We could even hear them hitting from where we were. The husband ran back to his campsite, and I watched as this thing chased him back, but it continued running towards the trail that we had all been on earlier. I then watched it follow that trail until it reached a bend, and it disappeared into the forest. We never saw it or heard from it again after that. The husband and wife packed up their things instantly, though, said goodbye, and drove off in their car. I stayed the rest of the night by myself, and I didn't sleep a wink. I still don't know why or how I even did that. The next morning I packed up my stuff and left as quickly as possible. Needless to say, I have not been back to Yosemite since then because it completely ruined the experience for me. And no, this thing wasn't a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot or whatever people want to call them. It was something else entirely that almost looked like an alien with gray skin and black eyes. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't normal at all. I've been camping and hiking all over the country, and I've never experienced anything like this. Whatever it was, it wanted us out of that campground, and it did everything in its power to scare us away. Grand Teton National Park holds a secret that I'm not sure many people know about. I mean, it's not really a secret in the sense that you can't find out about it, but more like I'm not sure how many people know of its existence. In one section of the park, there's this small lake, and it's fed by a small stream. The lake isn't very large, and the shoreline is heavily wooded with pine trees. There's also a trail that sort of runs near it, but other than that, it's pretty secluded from the rest of the park. So, I was hiking along this trail in 1992 when this all happened. I was walking along, minding my own business, when I heard something splashing in the water, loudly splashing off to my right. And when I looked over, I saw something that I could not believe. I even took off my sunglasses and put on my regular glasses to see it more clearly. But it was really there. There was a creature in the water, and it was covered in hair. Long, shaggy brown hair, and the shape of the thing looked like it was part human and part animal. Obviously, I had never seen anything like it before. The thought even crossed my mind that someone was filming a movie or something. Basically, my brain was trying to rationalize what it could be, but ultimately I was so shocked that all I could do was stand there and stare at it. Fortunately, the creature didn't seem to notice I was there, which made me feel a little bit safer. So soon my emotions turned to being curious, and I wanted to get a closer look. I slowly made my way over to the edge of the lake, being careful not to startle it or let it know I was there. And when I got close enough, I could see that it definitely looked like some kind of large dog, and it had 2 arms and 2 legs that were covered in thick fur. The creature's body was also furry, but the face was hairless. And I could now see that it had 2 large eyes and that they were staring straight at me. I stood there for a few minutes just watching the creature. It was clear that it was not afraid of me one bit, and I wasn't sure what to do about that. Do I stand still? Do I move? Finally, I decided to leave it be and continue on my hike, thinking there had to be some logical explanation for this. So I was walking along when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came this blood-curdling scream that sounded like it was coming from a human being. It was so loud that it actually made me jump. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out what it could be, and then a few minutes later came another scream that sent shivers all over my body. And I was actually starting to get scared at this point, but I kept on going because I didn't know what else to do. But then as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart stop. There in front of me was the creature that I had just seen in the lake. But now it was out of the water, and I could see that it was standing on its 2 legs, and it looked like that's the way it always walked. And it was also covered in something that looked an awful lot like blood. I stood there not knowing what to do when the creature suddenly lunged at me with its sharp claws extended. I screamed and I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I hid behind a tree just trying to catch my breath. I was so scared, I was shaking all over. After a few minutes, I peeked out from behind the tree to see if the creature was still there, but it was totally gone. Thankfully, I made it away safely, and I have never seen that thing again. But ever since that day, I can't help but wonder what it was that I saw. Was it some kind of animal that had never been seen by mankind before? Or was it something else entirely, like a mutant of some kind? And why was it bleeding? I didn't really notice any wounds, but they could have been covered up by fur. I eventually came to think that the reason I saw it was because it was injured, like the way you only see some animals if they're sick or injured and not acting like they normally would. There's no real way that I'll ever know for sure about any of that, but one thing is for sure. That experience left a very lasting impression on me. Well, more than a lasting impression, really. Thoughts of what happened actually consumed me for a few months afterwards, but eventually they started to dissipate, and I eventually got over it. Well, mostly, other than a few nightmares that still tend to creep into my dreams every once in a while. I'm hoping that writing this to you will help me get past those, too. My fingers are crossed. Say a prayer for me if that's something you do. Thank you, everyone. I have a really embarrassing dog, and so far he likes to hump everything. He had been to the vets and had his special operation, so he can't really cause any harm, just embarrassment. And when I say he likes to share love with everything, I do mean everything, not just other dogs. There is nothing this dog won't hump, including tree trunks and other things that he finds in the woods. So you can imagine why walks can be pretty stressful, and why I try and find more remote spots for us to go. And if he takes a liking to a tree trunk, he can have at it without me having to explain to some owner that he's just a lover, but there won't be any puppies. Anyway, I managed to find the spot with a lot of trees and not a lot of people or other dogs. We'd been going there a couple of months, and things were swell for the most part. He could run off, do whatever, and there was literally nobody else about. Some of the shame, at least, appeared to be lifting. Of course, I always knew he'd meet his match. He's a mongrel mix, kind of average size, but maybe like German Shepherd. So big enough to add extra torment when he takes a liking to smaller dogs. We'd always joke that one day he'd try it on with something like a buck and get a good kick in the face. When he came running back to me that day, tail between his legs and whining, and an obvious bite mark on his back, my first thought was that he'd gotten away and gotten into more than he'd bargained for. I was super curious, though, and wanted to go over and see what it was. He was acting really weird, cowering, and I couldn't drag him back into the trees. What I saw next would terrify me. It was on all fours. You would obviously expect that from an animal, but it didn't look right. And then I saw why. Because it came out to stand in front of the trees and then stood up on two legs like a man. This animal was covered in fur, similar color to mange. Unlike my dog, though, it looked very comfortable and natural standing on two legs. And even the arms were just dangling by the sides like they were meant to be there, not on the floor. A natural human posture coming from any animal is really disturbing. Oh, and by the way, the bite mark on my dog's back that I originally saw was pretty bloody. Whatever bit into him bit in pretty deep. He had to end up going to get stitches, but that's later on. Even this thing's head was similar. It looked kind of like a German Shepherd, but its face was somewhat human. And whereas my boy has a dopey expression on his face, this thing just looked mean. Not just the sheer size, but it had a very angry aura around it. Once it saw us, it began baring its teeth and growling. I yelled out, my dog barked, and we ran, and we finally got back to the car. Now, I need to find a new place because I don't want to invest in one of those long retractable leads and hope my dog doesn't upset any other men's dogs. Or we run into that creature again. That was scary. And while I don't believe in fairy tales or werewolves, I can't deny there aren't things out there that will attract themselves to other animals. Like my dog, for instance. I believe it wanted to turn my dog into dinner, make it its prey. I did a really stupid thing and fell asleep in a boat on the bayou. Considering that the gators and croc population was up in those days, that was an especially stupid thing for me to do. But I had been drinking, and the swamp sounds had been so soothing, I felt succumbed to the relaxation and conked out. I woke up to the sight of what looked like logs with eyes drifting all around me. I knew that if I started rowing, those logs would beeline me and I'd be in for a world of trouble. I hoped that they would go away on their own, but that turned out to be a very foolish hope. The exact opposite happened. One of them got tired of waiting and started carving V-shaped ripples as it headed straight for me. Now, maybe it was the liquor or the hangover from it, but I watched as that crocodile or alligator or whatever it is comes straight for me, and I was ready to go. But then there was a ripple on the surface and some bubbles, and the alligator or whatever was gone. Stranger yet, the others started fleeing from my location. I was expecting the one submerged alligator to launch itself out of the water and slam itself into my boat, but instead it emerged on the far side of the bank, and it looked like it was scrambling for its life. I kid you not, a large black clawed hand reached out of the water and grabbed its tail and yanked it back under the water with such incredible force that this thing stood no chance. Now, I don't know how much you know about the autonomy of an alligator, but the tail ain't the weakest part of their body by far. The simple fact that this animal was wrestled back into the water by its tail with one hand at that raised some serious questions about what sort of thing or person was manhandling it. A few moments later, I could see that there was no man doing the manhandling. The chaotic splashing drifted over to the bank, where I can only describe it as a towering monster that looked like a wolf, coated in slime, emerged with an iron grip on the croc's dead body. Thrash as it may, there was just no escaping, and it was one of the bigger alligators I'd ever seen. For a moment, I thought the whole thing would turn around with the alligator it had in its jaws and the large head of a monster, but the thing took its two massive claws and grabbed either side of the mouth and pulled it open very wide. I could hear the jaws snap, and I knew right away that the animal had been broken. This hulking wolf monster then proceeded to bash its prey against a tree in rage. Ever see a croc had its brains beaten out? I did that day. It was as terrific as it was terrifying. Even though I stood to be lunched just a few minutes earlier, I couldn't help but feel sorry. It literally had no fighting chance and might as well have been a puppy in the clutches of an eagle. If you'd met me, you'd see that my hands shake. It's why my voice shakes, too. I came so close to death, and then I watched death incarnate in the flesh rise up and break a predator that I feared as if it was just a mere toy. That is why I stay out of the bayous. I've heard tales of what people described as hulking-sized werewolves, but I always just thought it was a wives' tale. Silly ghost stories to scare kids that are told around the campfire. That is, until I saw it for myself. I was more amazed at the sheer size of this animal or creature or thing. It was kind of like a human, except nearly 8 to 9 feet tall, with a massive Arnold Schwarzenegger-like body, covered in thick, long black hair, with a massive head of that of a wolf. To say it was a werewolf, well, I don't believe in people changing into wolves at the full moon, but aesthetically this thing lined up with what many consider to be a werewolf, except it looked much fiercer and hulking than I could have ever imagined. That's why I now permanently stay out of the swamps. I know those tales are real. I don't know if they're demons or if they're living animals or whatever they are. I prefer to consider them guardians of the swamp. And I guess that day, however you want to look at it, this thing was looking out for me, or so I'd like to think. I was on a fishing trip with my uncle. I normally am not up for that sort of thing, but come on, the man was dying of cancer. He had spent most of his life trying to get me to like fishing, and he had all but failed. So his wishes were that I would go fishing with him and at least pretend that I was enjoying myself. I couldn't say no to something like that, especially under those circumstances. I met my uncle on his own property. He owned the better part of 3 smaller lakes in Tennessee. Well, they weren't really lakes. They were more like oversized ponds, not recognized as lakes by any stretch of the matter. It was the kind of land that you could just live off of and just forget about any concept of an outside world with cares and problems and troubles. That was pretty much what my uncle had done. He got wrapped up in spending all of his free time lost in the fantasy world of fishing until the reality of the disease came calling, leading his mortality on a leash. And somewhere in all of that, one of the first things he had thought of was me. So, how do I say no to something like that? We pushed off and got further away from shore. I had forgotten just how much land my uncle had owned. My uncle sat back in the little rowboat and tipped his hat over his eyes and fell asleep. I shook my head and ceased pretending to be interested, whether my fishing line was really catching anything or not. I loved the man, but the business of becoming a vegetable while waiting for a fish to take bait just really wasn't my thing. I was lost in the restless daydream when my line not only went taut, but the entire rod was yanked out of the boat. It took me 1 second too long to respond, and the whole thing was now lost in the water. I couldn't imagine what sort of thing was big enough to take away my uncle's equipment so quickly, and with so much force. Unfortunately, I wouldn't have to imagine very long. Somewhere in the cloak of the mist, not hugging the water, I heard what sounded to be a great deal of splashing. Then I heard growling, mingled with a yelping sound. Something was in pain, and it didn't sound like a fish. Then came the very frustrated howl as 2 points of dim light danced somewhere in the gray void. I did that dumb thing, and I began to row towards it, thinking of the possibility of coming across a raving lunatic or a pack of wild animals that could be panicked and dangerous if they were caught up in the fishing line. I had hoped that the 2 points of light were an indicator of people, but they were far, far from it. Well, they turned out to be eyes. It was like something from an old cartoon that I used to watch when I was a kid. A towering monster. A wolf thing that had gotten the hook sunk into its body and was having a dickens of a time getting it out. Its clawed fingers weren't suited for the fine manipulation it would take to work a small bit sturdy hook out of its body. And it was getting now stuck in the line. The thing was visibly angry and perhaps distraught. The sight of it alone was terrifying, and had I been more attuned to animals, I might have had the mind to help it if it didn't stand more than 7 feet tall and walk around like you or I. What kind of wolf creature walks around on its hind legs? Werewolves, that's what. But I had absolutely no preparation in my mind for ever running into such a thing. So I was speechless and directionless. I ended up rowing away quietly, hoping that it wouldn't catch our scent or come after us. It bolted off into the woods with the line still wrapped around it. I had a hell of a time explaining to my uncle what happened to his fishing gear, or actually even clarifying that this thing clearly looked strong not to break the line, but that didn't seem to be a problem. The hook seemed to be lodged somewhere in its chest. I don't know how or what, but it seemed like it was having a really hard time digging it out. being halfway into the water and covered in the mist. And I don't know why it bolted away or why it didn't come after us. Either way, it was completely and absolutely frightening. I'm just glad my uncle didn't see it. The poor old man would have probably had a heart attack. I'm an adult now, but the story that I'm about to tell you, although it happened when I was a kid, will never leave me. It's one of the scariest encounters I've ever had, and for years it's kept me awake at night. I was 10 at the time, my brothers were 6 and 13, and we, along with our parents, were off on a wonderful adventure. Well, that's how it felt to us. In reality, we were in a truck pulling a trailer in which we thought we were going to spend a few days driving around, finding fun stuff to do in the day and cool places to park at night. It was on the way back from one of the fun places, a carnival where I'd finally gotten to experience some of the big kid rides, and while we were on the lookout for some place to camp at night, when it happened. It was early evening, around 8:30 at night, and since it was summertime, it was still pretty light outside. My little brother was fast asleep, having been worn out from all the fun, and I remember thinking I would likely also doze straight off as soon as my dad found somewhere to park. And that's when there was a really, really loud bang which came from the very rear of the trailer. I remember my dad stopping and cursing, and my mom simply insisting that he get out and check it, as possibly a deer had run into the back. After all, she was a real sucker for any animal, stray or not, so she didn't want to think that it could be lying out there hurt. My dad opened the door and told us all to stay in the truck while he took a look. We did, but of course we scooted around so we could see exactly what was happening. After a few minutes, he came back to the window to talk to Mom, and I remember he looked kind of puzzled. There's a huge dent in the back of the trailer, but I don't see an animal anywhere. I can't think of a single animal that could make a dent like that and just walk away. Of course, we all wanted to go out and see that since this was the 70s and there was far less traffic on the roads. And we were also in the middle of nowhere. It was highly unlikely another vehicle would come steaming through, so we all went around back to the trailer except my brother Jimmy, who was somehow managing to sleep through the entire show, and we oohed and awed at the size of the dent. My dad may have used a few more expletives here on what on earth could have caused it. And that was when we heard the very, very low-pitched growl. Immediately, my mother told us to get back in the car and lock the doors. She came back in too, while Dad stayed for just a moment. He wanted to know what the cause of the damage was from. And Mom was yelling, "Jerry, get back in the car!" But for some reason, my dad moved closer to the side of the road where the growling was coming from. We were all turned around in our seats to be able to see, and that's when we saw this thing. Emerging from the trees at the side of the road came a rather enormous-looking creature, and it was taller and broader than my dad and covered in this gross, thick black hair. It stood up on 2 legs like a person and had long, dangly arms. And then there was the head. The head was huge. It looked way out of proportion with the body, even though that was massive too. Oh, and it was the head of a dog. That's right. This thing that came out of the trees growling at my dad made a huge dent in the back of the trailer with no damage to itself and was a virtual giant standing on 2 legs. Needless to say, we learned a few more curse words and Dad yelled and ran back to the car. He slammed the door and put his foot down on the gas pedal. Bam, we were out of there. Dusty. I kept staring back at the side of the road. Seatbelts weren't a really big thing back then. And that thing just stood there watching until we rounded a nearby bend and we couldn't see it anymore. We drove and drove that whole night way further than we intended to, but my dad wanted to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. I sure as hell don't know exactly what it was or how something like that even existed in our world, but with God as my witness, I will tell you it was real, and I will never forget it. Brockway Mountain Drive is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I was in the service for almost 10 years. I saw a lot of the world, and still, that place between Copper Harbor and the Upson Lake Nature Sanctuary is one of the most beautiful. But on that day in December, the beauty was lost on me. My car was a mess. It was this rusted old coughing Ford Escort mini station wagon. It was on its last breath, but I really thought I could squeeze one more winter out of it. But as I rolled to the top of the Brockway Plateau just west of Copper Harbor, I had had enough. It died. It would not start, and it immediately got cold as a witch's titty in a brass bra. I already had a rusted-out floorboard that caused snow and or slush to spit up in my face while I was driving, and the passenger window was double-thick saran-wrapped duct taped together. When it died on the top of the hill, I took a minute and got out and had a smoke, then prepared for the ritual. The ritual was me heaving to push the car down the hill and pop the clutch to get it started. Today, my hope was only to make it back home. I had to get a new car. The time had come. I put it in neutral and pushed the Escort to the edge of the plateau with the driver's door open, gave her one last shove and jumped in, and down the hill I went. Shit! I popped the clutch, and for the first time the damn thing did not turn over. It rolled to the lull at the bottom of the hill and just stopped. Shit. Now I was stuck here until someone came along to give me a ride, and I had no idea how long that was going to be. And to make things worse, I was down to my last smoke. I did not even bother to push the Escort off the road. I was just so pissed off I sat there and lit up my last Marlboro. I was leaning back, cold as hell, and facing west, looking at the snow, trees, and the little tiny unlined, patched-up, pothole-ridden pavement, when a giant animal walks dead center, about 200 yards away. I almost choked on my cigarette. I felt all the hair on my body standing straight up. I lived in the Upper Peninsula, and we got so used to things we sometimes forget that we are in the wilderness up here. And what the hell was this thing? I remember thinking, oh my God, as it stopped in the middle of the road and just started casually walking towards me. I was so terrified for so many reasons. It was big. It was coming at me. I was alone in a car that would not start. I had no idea what the hell it was. I immediately started turning the ignition. Come on, come on, come on. I started screaming. I was about to get out and run back up the hill to the plateau to the east behind me, the same hill I had just rolled down, but to my shock, the Escort started. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I was so happy. Then this crazy-looking walking dog started yelling and began charging at me on all fours like a bull galloping at me. I wheeled the Escort wagon around and puttered my way up the hill. I had already accepted death. That Escort wagon would not make it away from a child on a big wheel. All I could do was floor it and hope I purred up the hill and made it over the peak to the other side, headed towards Copper Harbor. I was so thankful the car did not die on me. I looked back and saw the devil spawn standing on the top of the hill, all proud and boastful, howling and screaming. Please make it back to town, I kept saying. And I made it back to town. After that, I did get another car, but I never sold the Escort. I just couldn't part with her after she saved my life from that dog man. For the majority of my life, I've primarily lived in the panhandle of Florida, all the way from Jacksonville to Tallahassee and everywhere in between. I don't venture much to South Florida, or even Central. It's too hot. And I prefer the northern climate where you still get a bit of southern hospitality and the swampiness. There's just something about it I really enjoy. And not to mention avoiding the majority of hurricanes, even though being up here, you're still at risk. Anyway, one night I believe I saw something that I can't quite explain, that I don't feel really fits the description of what many would claim to be a Bigfoot. Right around my house are a lot of thick swamps, and I was driving home one night, probably around 7 o'clock at night. The sun was near setting, so there was still a little bit of light outside. As I turned a corner, this figure had its back towards me, and all I saw was hair. I didn't think he was standing upright at first, or at least not all the way, because as I came around the corner and my headlights lit it up, it turned and almost kind of twisted its whole body to meet my oncoming car, with the headlights illuminating its face. The first thing I noticed was that it was most certainly not a deer, and how ugly it was. But in just a few seconds, my eyes ventured down to see what it had in its arms. It looked to me like it was putting a deer in a headlock. And then I realized that this thing had hands like a person, but with long black claws at the end of each finger. This thing had apparently snapped the neck of a deer and was holding its limp neck in its hand. As my eyes went back up to meet this thing, it had a very ugly face. Think of like a mix between a dog and a monkey, or a bat. Very short-snouted, but very much like a dog, just really ugly. Maybe not like a short-snouted dog like a pug. Think more like a wolf or German shepherd with a much shorter snout and teeth protruding, and much uglier, like the eyes were sunken in. It looked kind of creepy looking, and then my eyes went back down to it holding or hiding its deer, and then it quickly turned its back again, as if to hide what it had. But at this point, I had just driven past it. All this happened, what I described to you, in a matter of probably 5 seconds as I approached it. It was the creepiest thing ever. This was no more than probably 3 miles away from my house. The entire road is surrounded by bald cypress trees, Spanish moss growing everywhere. This thing, creature, animal, call it whatever you want, was right between the trees and the road. I'm not sure why it appeared to be trying to hide the fact that it killed a deer and was holding it by its broken neck, all while acting like it was hiding what it was doing, like it was trying to do something in secret. I'm still not sure. Again, I've lived here for most of my life and I've never seen anything like it. Come to think of it, though, I've had friends who claim they've seen a skunk ape, and I've never seen nor heard that either. I've seen everything that Florida pretty much has to offer, and much of the South as far as wildlife goes. This was a first for me. Southwick, Massachusetts, 2004. Back in 2004, I moved back in with my parents to their small town of Southwick, Massachusetts. My husband stayed in our home in Springfield because of work, but I moved in with my parents when I was pregnant with our third child. My other 2 sons were around 5 and 3 years old at the time, and a helping hand around the house was much appreciated. My parents had lived in Southwick their entire lives. They were childhood neighbors before they got married. That's just one example of how close-knit this community is. It was the kind of place where you could walk to the next-door farm, pick all the vegetables you needed, and leave money on the front porch or by the kitchen window. My sons were thrilled to be here. They now had a bigger playground and more areas to wander. I didn't mind because the town was so small that you could step out on the front porch and see everything. The house was on an elevated hill and had fields surrounding it. The largest field was behind our house, which bordered Southwick Woods, a forest with historic significance. There were many fields and farms throughout the town, resembling the layout of other towns in Massachusetts, and my parents' house was a typical New England home. Big windows, built around gardens, with a large front porch. Dad was part of a local municipal committee, which kept him busy a few days a week, and Mom had worked as a primary school teacher for a decade when all of us moved out for college. This was no surprise because it's effortless for her to engage with children. She was a great help with my boys, too, even though they could be a handful. One morning, my eldest son, Jake, greeted us in an absolute state of disarray. He said that he had heard loud noises at night, and when he looked out his window, he saw a werewolf staring right at him. We initially took it as a kid's wild imagination until his younger brother came in from outside playing one day, crying. He said that he saw a giant wolf's head peeking from the trees behind the house. Since that day, both of my sons have refused to go outside. They say they both saw the wolf creature a few more times, but no adults were ever able to confirm. My dad would say that it was just a harmless wolf that had lost its way, but Mom would argue that barely any large wildlife has come this close to the town for more than 10 years. I'd worry a lot when the boys would start crying, but I never gave it too much further thought. Mainly because even if it really was a wolf sighting, someone else would have likely seen it, or the local newspaper would have mentioned the sightings. Things took a steep turn when Mom found large dog-type footprints all over the field behind our house. And days later, Dad's committee received the first official sightings of an abnormally large wolf lurking in the woods. It was the first time we started to believe the boys' encounter stories, but we were still confused by what it really was, especially with everyone stating that its size was enormous. Starting to get scared of the situation, particularly since the woods were right behind our house, my dad borrowed 2 German shepherds from the police chief, who was out of town for the weekend. I was overjoyed with the dogs coming to stay with us, and especially the sense of safety and distraction that the boys felt when the dogs arrived. But I questioned how they would stand a chance against any wolf that's described as a freak of nature. The following nights were uneventful, and the neighborhood might have forgotten about the wolf. Then on Sunday night, the evening before the police chief would come to collect his dogs, I woke up from a series of awful barks. I asked my mom to stay with the boys as Dad and I took the dogs and walked outside expecting a trespasser. Dad took his sidearm with him, even though it had been years since he practiced target shooting. We ran towards the backyard and followed the sound of the dogs barking at the edge of the forest. It was dark and neither of us could spot anyone or anything. So we tried soothing the dogs, but with little success. They kept barking until, strangely, one of them started whimpering. I strained my eyes to see in the darkness and was able to make out a dark black figure emerging from the long line of trees. It had a man-like build, walking on 2 legs, but was strangely large, probably 7 or 8 feet tall. It had black hair and a long, bushy tail. Dad seemed frozen, not knowing how to react. I was feeling a deep sense of fear as I watched the creature step into the moonlight with determination. It had eyes as red as blood, and I would bet that they could be seen half a mile away. The head was like a wolf, but bigger. Both of the dogs started to whine and ran back to the makeshift shed adjacent to the house. I could not make out what was standing in front of me. It looked ferocious, and I was feeling stuck and helpless in the nightmare. And then the creature screeched the most dreadful howl and returned back into the woods. It all happened in a second. Dad's hand was shaking as he tried to grab the firearm from its holster, but I stopped him. There's no need to make things any worse or make the creature more angry. We quickly made our way back to the house, and we were still shaking from the incident as we walked inside. Dad spent the entire night processing what he had just seen. Within 24 hours, my husband came and took me and the kids back to our house in Springfield. Mom and Dad didn't want to come with us. They said that they'd been there all their lives and it's all they know. Of course, I can't stop worrying about them. No one ever encountered the dog man again. No further sightings were reported. My parents never did move away, and in fact, they got their own dog shortly after we left. I'm sure they both feel safer now. But I still get shivers remembering that night and thinking how I wish I never knew that creatures like that prowl in the dark. This story takes place in Huntsville, Alabama in the summer of 2017. I was outside on a sunny afternoon in the heart of Alabama. It had to have been June of 2017. Well, at least I know it was 2017 because it was the 25-year anniversary of my mom dying. I had grown up in that house, and I lived there with my own husband until he passed away a few years earlier. Anyway, that day I remember I was outside thinking of my mom and tending to her roses, relaxing in the sun, when all of a sudden something large and dark rushed past me from the front of the house and back into the cornfield. Now, corn hides a lot from view. We kids used to hide in the rows when we were little. Bobby Jo, my younger sister, even got lost once, and all we could do was hear her crying, but it took a half hour or so to actually find her. I've never seen a kid so scared in my life. Me, I was smart. I stayed out of the middle of the field. I only went a few rows in so I could always find my way out. However, this day was different. Whatever ran past me ran right into the cornfield. It went in fast, and it was big, but it moved in a way that seemed light and agile. I squinted in order to see the thing better, and I crouched down to see into the field further, down low where the corn isn't as thick. I don't know why I did it. Squinting never improves anyone's vision anyway. I started to wonder if I needed new glasses because I figured I should have been able to see this thing in more detail. And now I was super curious. I got up and started walking toward the corn. The neighborhood kids always liked to come on the property to play games. I figured it was just one of them up to no good again. Maybe one of them hiding from their friends. I yelled over towards the figure in the corn, waving my hand in the direction to get its attention, telling it, "Be careful, don't get lost in there." But there was no response. I thought that was strange because normally the kids know when they've done wrong and they come out and apologize for trespassing. You see, at this point in my life, I was the grandma to all of them in our town. But this time there was no answer, and the air seemed really still, and that caused a little chill to start up my spine. I would later blame that on the breeze, but to be honest, I don't believe there was one that day. I swallowed tightly, wondering why the kid wasn't answering like they normally do. So I walked closer to the cornfield and soon noticed down on the ground some kind of an animal print. It looked like maybe some kind of wolf. In all my life, I had never seen a wolf print before, and I don't even remember actually seeing a wolf since they are rascals and they are really good at hiding. But my dad used to tell me all kinds of stories about wolves, and none of those stories were good. But I bravely walked further into the corn and towards where the dark shape had gone. And then soon, a few feet in, I could start to make out some dark fur. And I stopped to think about how this kid must be hotter than heck wearing whatever he was wearing. So I called out for him to listen to me and come out real nice. And that's when it happened. Before I could say another word, the thing took a step, and a dark, hairy foot came out into the light. It looked like the leg of a wolf, but it was standing upright, meaning just one back leg was in view. I thought I must be seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, and that's when the creature shifted its weight and leaned towards me. Now I could see the wolf body ended at the waist, and it became sort of like a man with light-colored skin. On the neck was the head of a huge dog, though, or at least that's what the thing looked like to the best of my description abilities. Some kind of shepherd, I think, like all brown and black. The thing that made the creature so disturbing to me weren't the sharp teeth, those long, pointed teeth. It was actually the eyes. They were yellow. Now I'm talking bright, really bright like the sun. They were the kind of eyes that struck your soul when you looked at them. And we were now both standing there, staring at each other. I couldn't help but think how its yellow eyes would match the corn when it was ripe. But at the same time, I was frozen in fear. Half of me wanted to run, the other half wanted to stay and just figure it all out. Figure out what it was. The half-man, half-dog, or whatever it was, growled lightly as it sniffed the air in my direction. I swear by that point the color had completely drained from my face. There's no way that no one ever heard of an old woman being as frightened as I was in that moment. Somehow, though, I also had the thought right then that my church friends were going to love my story. I mean, we never get anything strange in our town. So then the creature leaned closer to me. I caught the whiff of a familiar smell, like salty corn. And it wasn't coming from my crops either. This was the distinctive scent to German shepherds and beagles. The whole thing just wasn't right, not right at all. I started to question my sanity. Maybe I was imagining the whole thing. Or maybe it was a trick of one of the kids and they were playing with me. They were always up to no good, fooling around. I folded my arms over my chest, feeling some of the fear drain from my body. I was feeling a little like my old self again. That was, until I felt the drool splatter from its mouth. And then everything suddenly became very, very real. I never did see a creature quite as tall as that thing ever before. The thing must have stood nearly 8 feet tall, must have weighed a good, 300 pounds. It was massive. I knew I stood no chance of defending myself. Doubt there was much I could do but just scream. If I was lucky my heart would actually attack me, I would just die right there. But I guess God had other plans for me. The neighborhood kids happened to run into my yard right at that moment, and the creature swung its head in their direction. They weren't close to us yet, and probably didn't even know that I was a few rows into the cornfield. The beast-like creature now turned completely in their direction. Its left ear twitched, and then it turned again, and it dashed back into the cornfield for cover. I could hear it running on 2 feet across the rows, and then I didn't hear it anymore, and it was just gone. I cocked my head and I tried, but I couldn't hear anything at all now. The kids came through the yard further and over to the field where I had entered it, and this time I was grateful for them to be looking for me. In the end, I think it seems like the creature didn't want to hurt anybody, because I think it easily could have. I kept my eyes peeled after that day any time I was ever outside, but never did I see that thing since. I reckon it was just passing through the area. I hope. Made me wonder if there were more like it out in the world. I guess there would have to be, because you can't just have one of some living creature. If there's one, there had to have been more in order for it to even exist. But I was just glad I didn't have to see any more of them. That could have been the complete death of me. It was a cold winter day in 1979, and I was driving my patrol car on a local state highway here in Wisconsin. It was around noon at this point, and I had been out there since 6 in the morning. I was tired and hungry, but still on duty for another hour or so. The road I was driving on is a 2-lane highway with no shoulder or guardrail. There are houses scattered along the road for about 3 miles, but then it opens up to farmland for another 8 miles before you get to town. So as I was driving along, I saw this old guy walking down the middle of the road, heading towards me. He looked disheveled and kept his eyes down and on the road. As I rolled up to him slowly, he never even lifted his head. So I pulled over and asked him if he needed a ride anywhere, if he was okay. He looked shaken, but told me no, that he was just out for a walk and that he lived down the road and was just getting some exercise. I said okay, but asked him to please get out of the middle of the road, stay off to the side, and stay safe. He shook his head a bit in agreement without looking up and moved off the side, but just kept going. So I sat there a while and continued watching him walk. He never looked back. Eventually, still watching him in my rearview mirror, I pulled away and continued on slowly. I was still focused on him when about a half a mile up the road, in the area that he had been coming from, I approached something laying on the side of the road. An animal. Something that looked like it had been hit by a car. I instantly thought how strange it was that the old guy didn't mention anything to me about it, but then again, he barely did say anything to me. This animal, it was about 4 feet from the edge of the road, so I figured somebody must have hit it pretty hard to knock it that far off and into the ditch. Maybe the old man didn't see it, but that would be very unlikely. I slowed down to look out the window at the thing lying there dead and eventually stopped my vehicle and got out. I put my hand on my gun and slowly walked towards it, with my senses alerted just in case it was still alive. I mean, I know from experience that a deer that seems dead can still kick a mean punch if you get too close. So as I approached, suddenly this thing quickly reacted to my presence. It stood up on 2 legs, and it started running towards the strand of trees to the right. It ran fast, and it ran on its hind legs with its arms swinging in front of it. I'm sure I had a crazy look on my face as I watched it because my head was swimming trying to comprehend. The creature was about 7 feet tall and covered in long brown hair. I kept blinking to try to be sure that I really was seeing what I was seeing. I froze for a moment, trying to process it all, and then I drew my gun and started running after it. I don't know why I did that, but I did. I guess my training kicked in or something. It eventually crossed the entire field and ran into the trees, which is when I lost sight of it. My heart was racing as I stood there at the edge of the tree line, listening for any sounds. But I heard nothing except the wind blowing across the fields. After a minute or two, I walked slowly back to my patrol car while looking back at the trees the entire time, still trying to compute it all. When I reached my vehicle, I hopped in and drove away very quickly towards town, hoping that someone else would have seen it or reported it. The entire way back to town, I kept thinking about the old guy, too, the guy in the road. I wonder if he saw it and kept his mouth shut, but why would he do that? His presence didn't make any sense in any of this, but seeing him was just as strange as seeing the creature, so in my mind, they're very connected. But then on the other hand, I started to wonder if I even really saw him. I just couldn't figure out what part he played in all of it. Ultimately, nothing was ever reported in the news. No reports were called in to the station. No other officers mentioned anything at all similar being seen by them. And eventually it all died down, and I started thinking of it less and less. But for years afterwards, especially when I would be out patrolling at night that road, I would sometimes feel like I could see a pair of yellow eyes looking back at me from the woods. They seemed to glow in the dark, and it always gave me a pit in my stomach. I often wondered if I was just imagining those eyes, like something still lingering from PTSD or something. And since this was way back in the 70s, there was no way to easily look things up or find information back then. And I wasn't about to talk to many people directly about it, so I just kept it all inside. However, in recent years, I've been able to poke around on the internet and search. My final conclusion after reading a ton of info is that I think it was a dogman. Yes, I honestly think that the thing I saw all those years ago was probably one. Truthfully, I still get chills thinking about it, and I'm glad now that nothing bad happened to me that day, especially with how stupid I was to follow after it. And I still wonder what happened to the old man in the road, and what part, if any, he played in all of it. Truly, even though I think I know what happened that day, the inability to know 100% what really happened is the hardest thing of all for me. I mean, I just don't have any closure, but writing this is helping, and for that, I'm really appreciative. Thank you, Lilith. Thank you so much. Alaska, 2018. For someone who's never done it, it's hard to explain the feeling of watching an animal through the scope of a gun. It's kind of what I imagine a horse might feel like when it's wearing blinders, or what people are describing when they talk about having tunnel vision. It's hard to really describe, but it's as if the rest of the world just falls away. It's just you and the animal. Your whole world becomes contained in that tiny circle of what you can see through the scope, like everything has a frame on it. Everything shrunk into a vignette. Obviously, the world is still there, the scent of the outdoors, of the animal itself, the tiny, subtle noises it makes as it moves, and the held-in, restrained noises as you try to control your breath and stay as deathly quiet as you can. But there's a moment where everything, all of your senses seem focused on that one vision through the scope. It's a feeling I miss, but one I don't think I'll ever have again. Not after that day. We'd been out in the mountains for 2 days, camping in the forest low down and heading off each morning into the clearer areas in search of moose. I say it a lot, but you never really understand just how big those things are until you see one face to face in the wild. I think being brought up on drawings of moose and kiddies' books where they all get the scale wrong, you expect them to be about the size of a cow. They're not. They are huge. That day we had been following tracks of one and had come out into a clearing by the water. We had settled down and I'd set up my gun on a rest so that I could get a clear view over the riverbank and the area around. I had just squatted down behind some bushes when we heard the noise to our left. A cracking of branches, that unmistakable giving way that comes with something massive forcing its way through the bracken. I felt my breath quicken and squatting down with a mix of excitement and trepidation. I angled the muzzle of the gun toward the direction the sound had come from, and I brought my eye to the scope, and there he was. He was the biggest moose I had ever seen. His antlers alone were spread across almost the height of a man. I watched him trundle, totally oblivious, into the whole world circle of my view, and then he stopped. It was as if I'd focused on him and somehow hit the pause button because he just froze in place. I rested the butt of the gun against my shoulder and again fixed my sight on him, and that's when it happened. That moment where the rest of the world falls away. For maybe a minute it was just me and him, but then suddenly, it wasn't. Suddenly, something else came into the frame, an immense mass covered in hair that for a moment I thought was another animal, perhaps another moose, a deer, or even a bear. It was only after a second that the vision clarified and it dawned on me. What I was seeing was not an animal. It was part of an animal. A back, arched leg, skeletal thin and draped with a mixture of fur and what looked to be rotted flesh, and jutted into the view. It was almost the size of the moose. I don't know why I didn't run, why I didn't tear my eye from the scope and look properly. Maybe there was safety to it, a feeling that as long as I looked through the scope in this separated world, it might not be real. But it was. And as I watched, frozen in position, the head of the thing, more a skull than a true face, twisted forwards. I've never seen anything as hideous in my entire life. Massive things that were a knot of antlers and horns stabbed towards the sky. The flesh, again, hung in rotted tatters, hanging lengths, drooping from the bones like sails of a ship clinging to the skeleton of the mast. I had heard local talk about the Wendigo, but I'd never believed them. I believe them now. The next thing I knew, my friend was gripping my shoulder, wrenching me backward. I ran and didn't stop running for almost 2 miles. I didn't pick up my gun, didn't go back to camp, but kept moving. We both did. Through the night, groping ever forward, desperate to get out of the forest, out of the mountains and away, feeling with every step that the darkness was just behind us. I have never been hunting since, and I never will again. There are things far worse than animals lurking between the trees. I know because I've seen them. California, 2019. I remember as a child sitting in my elementary school classroom while our teacher, who I thought was super nice, read us the book The Very Hungry Caterpillar. The story tells of a caterpillar with an insatiable appetite. He continues to eat and grow fatter and fatter with every meal. It was a favorite of the class. It was the one book they always requested, no matter how many times we had all heard it. The children loved it. All of them but one. For me, the story of a creature with an insatiable hunger had horrible memories of another story I'd heard, the one told by my grandparents, in which, unlike the caterpillar, was supposedly real. While the caterpillar would eat only silly meals and vegetables, the central character in my grandparents' tales had a much more sinister diet. The Wendigo, according to my grandparents, could never be full. It was for this reason that its body was so skeletally thin, an emaciated wreck from which the skin and flesh hung in long rotted sinews. Everything the Wendigo ate was absorbed into it so that the creature grew bigger and bigger but was never satisfied. The result was a never-ending hunger, a churning starvation that drove this creature that existed somewhere in a world between life and death to constantly hunt forever. Of course, that stupid, colorful children's story was nothing like the Wendigo, but the tale of its hunger was too close for comfort. As I grew older, I eventually forgot the Wendigo in the same way that you forget childhood fairy tales. I knew that clinging to these folk tales was part of my grandparents' attempts to retain and practice their culture, but it was also old-fashioned, or so I thought. I felt like it was a ghost story that they had presented to me as fact. I suppose in some ways it's similar to believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa. But this Wendigo story they told us was different, particularly because telling me about it and making me believe was not for my benefit, but more to scare me. Scare me enough that I'd be careful, or so they said. I could never understand that until I myself had children and saw for myself what my grandparents had been scared of. I could now clearly realize that what they did wasn't done out of cruelty, but as a warning. My son was in elementary school, and I decided one weekend to have a boys' camping sleepover before the new school year started. We drove a short bit north to a lake area that allows camping. We chose a spot near the lake and settled in. The sun had just gone down, and we were sitting by the fire making jokes and talking about his school friends, when there was a sound that somehow seemed to come from above us, but also all around us. I stood slowly, worried that perhaps it might be a bear or a bull moose. I checked the tree line and I could see nothing, but then I looked up. At first, I just noticed the bare branches clawing at the sky, but then from behind the trees, antlers. A set of thick, horned antlers so wide that it was simply impossible for them to be up there like that, or for them to belong to any living animal. After only a second, my brain went back in time to my childhood, and I knew exactly what was standing there. All of my grandparents' stories and warnings came back to me. Without a second's hesitation, I turned, grabbed my son, and began to sprint, leaving behind the camp and whatever else might have been lurking behind the trees. Behind me, I heard the branches cracking and snapping as something huge thundered through. I yelled for my son to close his eyes and not to look at what was chasing us. But as we turned the corner onto the footpath, my eyes, as if drawn and tugged by some invisible magnetism, turned to look back, and in a second I saw it. The Wendigo looked like the combination of several carcasses, all somehow stitched together and piled bone upon wasted bone atop one another to form a new warped frame. Its face, if you can even call it that, was like the skull of a moose or a deer, but grown and stretched to the proportions of an elephant or some other larger animal. In the eye sockets, it was yellow in the center, but with sticky old gray around the edges. It swiveled towards us while its tongue, thick and snake-like, hung and flickered hungrily, as if the thing were tasting the air in preparation to taste us. I knew in that moment what it was, what it wanted, and that it was hungry. That it would always be hungry, and that to this thing we looked like prey. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, and didn't look back. Now, when my grandparents talk of the Wendigo, I listen. Once my grandfather said something I didn't quite understand about it being my birthright and part of who I was to see the thing at least once. I guess my family is lucky. My son also listens, heeds the warnings that I ignored because, despite my telling him not to, he did open his eyes and saw that thing. Last Christmas, a friend bought him and my daughter a copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar. I cringed even then, thinking of a thing that can't be full and will always seek out and consume. Even though it was just a children's book, it cut too close to home. I threw it out before they had a chance to read it. I really wouldn't consider myself living off the grid. But when it comes to eating and buying meat, I only purchase from those who grow and farm locally. And just recently, back a month ago, I had bought roughly 12 pounds of ground beef and some steaks. I bought these from a local farmer who lives in the area since they raise all their own cattle and slaughter it all themselves. I prefer that much more than buying it from a store. Much cleaner and much leaner. If you or anybody who reads this gets the chance to try their own locally owned beef, well, I'd highly recommend it. But that's not what my story is about. So I go and pick up the meat, and it's a pretty cold night on this particular night. I want to say it dropped down below freezing. So on this night, I left the meat in these 2 large paper bags in my truck. The cab of the truck, that is. So I got out, locked my truck, went inside, and went to bed. Well, the next morning I got up to find something very peculiar. Something had tried to break into my truck over the course of the night. The handle was literally twisted off the driver's side door, and the glass was kind of bent in. Not shattered, but cracked down by the tire, and where you would stand to get up and open the door were the largest canine tracks I had ever seen. I was very puzzled by this finding, and I took the time to thoroughly observe who this potential robber could have been. I looked at the tracks, and they led all the way around the truck off into the grassy knoll. A most disturbing find is the tracks were not quadrupedal like you'd expect from a dog. They walked in a very bipedal fashion, some sort of bipedal canine with extremely large feet. I'm talking larger than my own 2 feet, and I wear a size 13 boots. So something came from this grassy knoll area, came over to my truck, and tried to break in. Keep in mind that in the morning it was still roughly in the 30s, so near freezing temperatures, which is why I left my meat there in the first place. My freezer, if you're wondering why I didn't put it away, was still in the process of being semi-functional, and I had to clean it out before I put the meat away, hence why I left it in the truck overnight to stay cold. Well, something must have smelled it, even though I had the windows rolled up and there's no possible way any animal or wildlife could have smelled it. At first I thought it must have just been a trick of the ground, and I thought to myself that it was a bear, but there were no bears around here. Maybe smaller black bears, but definitely not a grizzly bear or any large brown bear, since that's the only thing that would make sense to have this kind of power. I mean, had I taken pictures, something with tremendous force had to have ripped the metal handle off the door and nearly shattered the glass. Something was trying to get into the cabin of my truck. But why? I can only speculate that it was because of the meat in there.